Jay Callahan again, and this is another one of our video mini lectures for Social Work 645, Crisis Intervention. And our topic for this video is critical incident stress debriefing and psychological first aid. So let me say right off the bat that I would really like it if before you watch me here in this video that you would already have watched the video entitled Techniques of Debriefing, which is in Sakai, which obviously is about critical incident stress debriefing, and that also you would have watched the 3 short videos that I posted, which are from responding to crisis in the aftermath of disasters, a series of videos that demonstrate psychological first aid. So I'd like you to watch those videos so you can get a real flavor and a beginning education of what critical incident stress debriefing is on the one hand and what psychological first aid is on the other. And then of course there's one other piece among the written reading assignments for this week is the article I wrote about doing a debriefing with the Oklahoma City Police. And that will also give you, I think, a flavor and a beginning of what critical incident stress debriefing is like. All right, so let's talk about critical incident stress debriefing. Just briefly, I'm going to assume that you saw that video, and so I'm not going to repeat a lot of the information that was given in that, like the 7 steps that critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD, has a 7-step process, and that was outlined in the video. It's also important to keep in mind that CISD was originally designed for first responders, police, paramedics, firefighters, and it's a group process. So the idea would be first responders who went through a critical incident, which is really another phrase for a traumatic event, together, and therefore that there's value in pulling them again together as a group to process and discuss what happened. Later, on the other hand, it sort of became universal, and people have done debriefing with all kinds of different groups, including random groups of people from the public, individual versions of CISD, all kinds of variations on the theme that are not exactly how it was originally designed. But one thing that I think it is important to keep in mind is actually the context. In other words, this was set up for first responders, not the primary victims. And secondly, it was set up as something that they would, after the critical incident or the traumatic event, they would have gone home, they would have gone back to their regular jobs, and then the CISD session is set up typically 48 to 72 hours after the event, so that people then come back together as a group to have the session. So now, I just having just seen the video Techniques of Debriefing, I just wanted to make a few comments on some of the things that you saw in that video. And first of all is what I felt that the leader did a poor explanation of what a debriefing is. In the debriefings I've done, which I don't remember how many, and I've been thinking 50, but it might be more, maybe fewer than that, maybe 30, I don't know. But I was very much involved in this between maybe 2000 and 2010. With our local team, Northern Illinois Critical Incident Stress Management Team. And it was that group also, I was involved for the 90s, is that group that we went together to Oklahoma City to do that debriefing. But in any case, in the video that you saw, at one point the leader says, I'm here to tell you what a debriefing is and what it isn't. And then he goes on to talk about what it isn't, like it's not an investigation and it's not this or that, but he never really says what it is. And in the debriefings I did find it was very helpful just to say a few sentences, that basically a debriefing is a time for people who have been through a difficult situation, a critical incident, together to come back together to talk about that incident and their reactions to it. Something that simple. Basically, it's a group discussion to talk about what you all went through together. And although that sounds really super, some people come together for a debriefing and have no idea what it's about, and that raises anxiety, obviously. So I think that if you were ever in this position, you could do a little better job than the guy in the video did about explaining what a debriefing is. Secondly, when the mental health professional leader was talking to the 2 peer leaders, if you recall, there was a male police officer and a female paramedic. that he said something to them about managing the door and going and get people if they leave, and that is part of the original model. You know, you saw the video and you saw Jeff Mitchell, who was the main author of this model. And so the idea is, with groups like police, paramedics, and firefighters, it's a macho culture, and it takes the group process. And starting out with, as Mitchell said in the video, you start out with something out there and concrete, like what happened in the event, and then slowly move into your thoughts and feelings about it. And the idea about managing the door is that the danger would be that somebody in the group would get particularly upset, but be too embarrassed to show that in the group, and they would get up and walk out as if they're going to the bathroom, and yet actually just, you know, leave entirely, go out and get in their car and drive away. And so part of the original model, which is what I did when I did debriefings, would be to have one of the peer debriefers go out. When someone gets up and goes out ostensibly to the bathroom, one of the peer leaders goes out with after them, and then stops and talks to them. Doesn't necessarily go in the bathroom with them, but maybe in the hallway outside, just to make sure that they're okay and that they really are just going to the bathroom and they are coming back into the debriefing. Now, if it's maybe 30 of these that I did, I never had anybody get up and leave and then run away or anything like that. So, but anyway, that's the model, and that's just so you understand the video, that's what the manage the door business is. Now, that's you know, speaks to the other issue about the fact that the debriefing, there are no breaks. No breaks are taken, and that's also part of that idea about the necessity to slowly build an atmosphere in the group where people are willing to share their thoughts and feelings. And Mitchell's insight, which I think is, you know, absolutely true, is with groups like this, police and firefighters, if you have a break, they'll all go out in the hallway and, you know, have a glass of water or whatever, and begin to make jokes about it, you know. And you would have spent already maybe 45 minutes trying to create the atmosphere where people feel safe to talk about these kind of things, and then the jokes in the hallway will, you know, put you back to ground zero. So that's the main reason no breaks are taken. And if people have to go to the bathroom, they just have to get up and go. I mean, typically you don't say anything about that in the beginning. Now, I will mention also that when I was still at the University of Michigan, I had a number of occasions, I don't know, a handful, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5, let's say, where I was asked to do a debriefing for the staff of inpatient psychiatric units when they had a patient who died of suicide, and most often than not, I don't think any of them were on the unit, but a patient left a unit and then killed themselves a day or two after they went home. And I really only remember, I think, 2 of them, but what I do remember more clearly, pertinent to the idea of managing the door and not taking any breaks, is how different it was to get a group of mental health professionals. The one I remember the best was an inpatient unit at the University of Michigan. And so the debriefing, first of all, had way too many people. There was probably, 25 people there. And it included, from the psychiatric residents and the staff psychiatrists, and then the social workers and social work interns, 1 or 2 psychologists, psychology interns, the nursing staff, the aides and the techs, and the ward secretary. And what was so striking was they were already seated when I came in, and I came into the room and I closed the door and I barely sat down in my chair, and boom, they were into it. And they weren't into the superficial introductory phase. They were into their deepest thoughts and feelings about what happened. And it was very intense. It's a bunch of mental health professionals waiting to talk about something that was significant and traumatic for them. And so in that situation, I did call a break because it was getting too intense at one point. So using the break or not is a way to kind of modulate how intense the discussion gets. And I think that's an important way to think about it. The other thing I want to mention about the video that you watched was also the poor intervention by the police officer. Now, actually, it wasn't totally poor given the timing. But this is when the police officer comes in and says stuff like, you're talking about how you lost a life, but really you didn't lose a life, you saved a life. If you hadn't been there, both kids would be dead, and that's a heck of an accomplishment. Remember that? And I think you have to realize that the students I'm talking about here, realize that done too early in the CISD session would be a terrible intervention. It would basically shut everybody down and make it not a place where people could talk about things they felt bad about, or their fears, or their doubts. Remember in the video, for example, one of the firefighters said something like, "I feel like it was my fault that we didn't find the second kid by the nature of how we carried out the search." And then unfortunately they cut away from the rest of that scene. But the idea that people feel guilty about things like that is very common, and really needs to have time for that person to talk about that a little bit and receive support from the other group members. So if the police officer comes in and says you all did good, and none of you can say anything less than that, that would really cut off that conversation. Now it's a little unclear in the video when that happened, but it appeared to be after the reaction phase was over. So in that case, I guess it was probably okay. You just don't want to be doing something like that, like let's look at the good side, before people have a chance to talk about their fears and their doubts and the things that they feel upset about. Now the next idea is about the controversy about critical incident stress debriefing, which I've tried to summarize just a little bit here on the slide. That CISD is favored by a lot of practitioners out in the field who are working with first responders, but it's also been heavily criticized, mostly by academics who don't actually do the work, as, for example, not evidence-based. And we can talk more about that later. There really is not a whole lot of studies. There really are not a whole lot of studies, but there are some about CISD, and most of them show over the long run it doesn't make a lot of difference. In terms of trauma symptoms, 4 weeks later or 6 weeks later, typically not a lot of difference between groups that went through a debriefing and those that did not. On the other hand, it's well liked by the people that go through it. They often talk about how beneficial it is, even if they didn't know what a debriefing was at all. But then the other criticism of the studies were there are actually 2 studies out of 20 to 25 that showed that the participants who received CISD, as compared to people who did not receive one, that they were worse off in the follow-up. One was both were about individual victims. They were not group debriefings, which is supposedly the model. One of them was about, and neither were about first responders. One was about people who went through a fire and had severe burns. The other one was about people who had been in traffic accidents. And if you want to know more detail, I can tell you, but basically over a longer follow-up, those people seem to be doing worse. The ones that got a debriefing did worse. So this has been a controversy back and forth about, is CISD a valid intervention that we should be doing? It's been going back and forth for me 20 years. And the alternative that's offered is psychological first aid. So psychological first aid, I should change this slide, is really not exactly the same thing. Well, obviously not the same thing, but it isn't even like something you can replace into the same setting. It's not for people who go away after the critical incident or traumatic event and then come back together for a meeting, but rather, well, as you saw if you watched those videos, it's for individuals and families in the aftermath of a disaster who are in a shelter, or they're in an office waiting to talk to somebody, or they're already somewhere sort of on the scene. It's not after they go home and they come back to receive psychological first aid, but rather it's going around. People are stuck in the Louisiana dome, that the Louisiana Superdome, maybe it was called, after Hurricane Katrina, and they didn't have anywhere to go. They had lost their homes, and so practitioners of psychological first aid would walk around and make contact with groups of people and their families, and offer help, offer concrete help, or offer ways to help them get the help they needed, things like that. So there were no formal meetings. It wasn't like, let's meet tomorrow night and talk about this stuff. It was sort of just being there on the scene at the time. Now, some of the academic people who tout psychological first aid claim that it's more evidence-based, but even though there aren't that many studies of CISD, there's even fewer studies of psychological first aid. That is, none. Now, they claim that what makes it evidence-based is it supposedly addresses the more specifically the difficulties that people go through after having been a traumatic event. Like they need calmness and they need a sense of safety. And I wouldn't disagree with that, especially in a disaster, but CISD is aimed at the first responders who are safe and are calm afterwards. So anyway, the evidence-based issue is a controversy that's gone back and forth. But psychological first aid, as you saw, is similar to supportive psychotherapy. And the important differences between psychological first aid and critical incident stress debriefing is that in psychological first aid, there's a focus on immediate concrete needs, right? The family holed up in the Superdome and they need food for tomorrow night or whatever. Secondly, that the practitioners of psychological first aid could actually offer concrete help themselves. So sometimes a sponsoring organization would have them, you walk around where the groups of people are waiting for whatever with bottles of water or with food or snacks or things like that. So concrete help. And then the third major difference that gets focused on a lot is the designers of psychological first aid say that we shouldn't be asking people to talk about the details of the traumatic event in the immediate aftermath. And there's a variety of rationales for why that might be, but basically psychological first aid, there's no discussion of the critical incident. Okay, so that's like just a beginning little discussion about these two kinds of interventions, and we can certainly talk more about it in our synchronous session this week. As a final step, though, let me tell you what I think about this, how I think about it, and that is that they're used for different things, and that each is useful in its own domain, that CISD is effective for first responders after they've had a traumatic event or a critical incident, that psychological first aid is useful for primary victims after they've experienced some sort of natural disaster or situation. Now, as I've alluded to it, I have done a number of CISDs. I have not done psychological first aid myself. And that, maybe I didn't word this bullet point very well. Both are touted to people as being useful interventions and as helpful. But if you think about the context, still in each case, this is a policy decision by somebody at a higher level, some authorities who are saying, okay, in the case of CISD, okay, we think that when our police officers have gone through a bad event, we think we should offer CISD to them. And then they go ahead and do that. Or after a disaster, the disaster emergency authorities, the local FEMA, for example, might decide, while these people are waiting around in the community center to talk to the people about the insurance they might get because they lost their house in the flood, that we would have people doing psychological first aid, come around and talk to them. And these two situations are both different from when we've talked earlier in the semester about crisis intervention, the problem-solving model of crisis intervention. That's when people come in on their own, on purpose, seeking help from a social worker. So they're seeking help. There isn't a policy that they are complying with or not. This is them seeking out help. And in my experience, the vast majority of people who come seeking help, for one thing, they want to talk about the event. They want to talk about what happened. And so that makes it a different situation than the policy decision. Should we push or recommend that if we see people that they talk about the event or not, specifically? Different context, different situation. And I guess I would also add, though, that that virtually all long-term treatments for PTSD, now this is the immediate aftermath, and you could argue that it's different. And people do argue that it's different. The immediate aftermath is different than what you might do 3 months down the road. But the treatment for PTSD 3 months down the road is, there are a variety of different kinds of treatment, even more recent ones like the may know about, like EMDR, that all include talking about the event. So I really just want to argue that the wholesale statement that people should not talk about the traumatic event, that I don't buy it. I don't believe it. And well, anyway, we can talk more about this if you would like in our synchronous session. All right. So I'll see you next time.